Alright everyone, it's time for an extra video here talking of course about Beijing Biden's unconstitutional vaccine mandate attempt through OSHA. First and foremost, let me lay this out. There are several grounds upon which I truly believe that if a federal court, possibly SCOTUS, it's not clear, takes up the case, which is inevitable I believe against Joe Biden because you have multiple states that have banned the kind of vaccine mandates that he has just attempted to impose. And he didn't take questions, by the way, the other day after he talked about this. That was for a reason. He was asked point blank about the constitutional nature of his mandates. He refused to answer. Very telling. Here are some reasons why I truly believe that any federal court will shoot down Biden's attempted vaccine mandate. If it gets before SCOTUS, we may even see a rare 9-0 decision on this topic. First and foremost, let me get to the fallacy that's currently being circulated by Biden's shrinking fan base. They're pointing to a 1905 decision at the Supreme Court with regards to the constitutional nature of vaccine mandates and saying, well, a court over 100 years ago ruled that it was okay to mandate vaccination. It's legal to do that. The problem is that this particular case, if it were brought up in a court decision, if it were brought up in arguments, would more likely be brought up by the states that are against the vaccine mandate than by the federal government. They wouldn't touch this with a fucking 20,000-foot pole. Because what it really reiterates is state supremacy under the auspices of the 10th Amendment. You see, the vaccine mandate, and the one that they're talking about is smallpox, 1905 decision. The state had mandated that people get vaccinated against smallpox, and it was argued, hey, that's unreasonable and unlawful. SCOTUS sided 7-2 with the state and said, no, the state can proclaim that you have to get a vaccine. The reason why it had the right to mandate that is under the 10th Amendment. The rights and privileges not directly granted to the federal government belong to the states. In this particular case with Biden's OSHA overreach, and I'll get to the overreach in a moment because it's echoes of the CDC eviction moratorium, so I'll get into that, and I'll also get into the pragmatic argument. There are three main arguments against what Biden's doing. The problem is that this doesn't come as the result of legislation, and it's not coming from a state. It's coming from the federal government. Multiple states have explicitly passed legislation, again, legislation, not just an executive order in all cases, to ban such mandates from happening. If you're making the arguments of the 1905 case, therefore, it would seem to coincide more with the reasonable ability of states to opt out of vaccine mandates by saying the federal government does not have the authority to mandate that within the jurisdiction of our states. Only we do. Well, most states in the United States either have not mandated vaccines for any reasonable purpose or have outright banned them. Most states in the United States. Only a handful of states have vaccine mandates of any kind or another. So the first problem is that the use of this case is a fallacy. It has nothing to do with federal power. It has to do with state power. It has nothing to do with an executive order. It has to do with legislation. Legislation as in an actual law. A lot of people seem to think that an executive order, like if a governor or the president of the United States says you have to do X, Y, and Z, that becomes a law. That's not the way the legal system works in the United States. So that's number one. Number two would be the pragmatic aspect. The OSHA overreach decision by Beijing Biden is entirely non-pragmatic. It is completely arbitrary. Saying to employers that have more than 100 employees as opposed to 99 of them, you have to mandate vaccines or test everyone routinely, that's an arbitrary decision. It smacks of the CDC eviction moratorium, which was shot down by the Supreme Court not long ago. The fact is that the President of the United States does not have the unilateral capability, and this is the third point, to simply broaden the legal capabilities of a federal bureau, a federal group, etc., especially when there's no legislation involved. Legislation creates a group like OSHA. It creates a group like the CDC. It is enabled through legislation. The president, while he has executive orders at his disposal, cannot use them to circumvent the Constitution. The fact is that if OSHA has not previously been inclined to be interpreted as having the broader power under worker protections of saying, hey, you have to get vaccinated because otherwise people with the vaccine somehow will be hazarded by this, and that's it's a workplace condition that's unacceptable, we have to do something, that's He tried that with the CDC, and he failed. It was a 6-3 decision against that. Initially, it was a 5-4 decision to allow the initial eviction moratorium to continue because it was right at the end of the eviction moratorium period. Joe Biden coerced the CDC, openly noting, by the way, that it probably wasn't constitutional in the process, to continue it, and they got shot down by the Supreme Court. It wasn't a split decision, it was a 6-3. It didn't even follow along ideological lines. The one liberal justice, which is John Roberts, he is a liberal justice, and the swing Justice Kavanaugh both siding with the 4 conservatives on the court saying, no, that's not acceptable. So you've got 3 points against it again. The first one is that the case law that's being cited by the pro-vaccine mandate proponents actually would evince it would be used in court more likely by Montana, which is a potential plaintiff, Florida, Texas, other states where you have at least executive orders or outright legislation banning vaccine mandates. It wouldn't because it's a pro-10th Amendment decision, essentially, it's not going to help the federal government. The federal government's not a state. And this is what I've told people. The federal government has a lot less power than the states. This is why people, if you believe in libertarianism or populism as I do, you need to go from the bottom up. You need to take over your localities and provinces and counties and shit and then go after the state level positions. You can't start at the top down because the top has less power by design. I know the president's on TV all the time. He gives speeches and shit. It's largely a placeholder steward position, especially with a president who's clearly got dementia. Secondly, you can't unilaterally at the executive level, without any further legislation, without any involvement by the legislature, randomly decide, hey, by the way, OSHA has this extra power that it never had before. This was, again, already decided under the CDC decision, and the idea of not evicting millions of people, of course, less of a hot-button issue than the idea of employee vaccine mandates. There's a lot more, I think in the public, a lot more people would support the former than the latter. And like it or not, the judiciary is not really supposed to take into consideration public approval for a law or anything like that, but they do. That's just the way that they work. And again, number 3 is pragmatism. If I have a company with 90 employees, Biden's mandate doesn't affect me. If I hire 11 additional people, all of a sudden, magically, it becomes a public health issue. That arbitrariness is probably going to be weighed in federal court and possibly SCOTUS decisions as well. I would not expect Joe Biden's attempted mandate to exist very long. I expect it to be embattled by both corporations and by states. I expect them to win, largely, in their cases. It will probably go before SCOTUS, and in what will presumably be at least a 5-4, possibly even a 9-0 decision, I expect Biden to get yet another constitutional smackdown. This is now the 3rd time that Joe Biden has willfully disregarded the Constitution. And I'll be making a separate video about that tomorrow. The first, of course, is with the CDC moratorium. It was explicitly said by Kavanaugh, which would have flipped it 5-4 against Biden, that the CDC's eviction moratorium was not lawful. It was an overreach. You were attempting to take a bureau and broaden its powers beyond their initial scope without any legislation involved. The federal government was given the option of adopting legislation to enshrine the moratorium. Even then it might not have stood up to judicial scrutiny, but at least it would have had a chance. Instead, Biden, because he's working with a legislature that doesn't like him, like most Americans don't like him either, he decided, oh, well, I'll just take a flying fuck at a rolling donut. I'll use an executive order even though the SCOTUS has already told me how they will rule. I predicted that, and that's what happened. Second, of course, before that, was with the Farm Bill. You remember when they were trying to make handouts for farmers as part of COVID relief, partially racially based? It was struck down by the courts because you can't do that. You have to treat Americans equally. You can't earmark money for just black farmers and say to the white farmers, fuck yourself. It's not legal. This will be similar. I fully expect that this will be shot down. It's just a matter of how quickly it moves through the courts. Thankfully, in this current incarnation of SCOTUS, they've been slightly less reluctant to take up hot-button issues like this. I expect it to be fairly quick, and I expect them to rule against Joe Biden. In part, it would be extremely funny to me if in one of the judicial screeds that they write, of course, they give their opinion about decisions. It would be funny to me if Roberts or Kavanaugh or someone else invokes this 1905 decision and says, look, yeah, the states have a supremacy. Yeah, if they want to mandate state workers to get vaccinated or whatever, oh, okay, that's fine. By the way, I still oppose it, but judicially speaking, they may be found to have that power. But the federal government doesn't. And again, the non-pragmatic aspect of this decision, because there are a hell of a lot of companies out there that have less than 100 employees, it's not helpful. What problem is solved by Joe Biden's mandate? I love it when he says, I'm losing patience with these unvaccinated people. Fuck you. Nobody cares. Nobody cares if you lose patience. The American people have lost patience with you, waiting for you to make one goddamn stupid decision that doesn't totally wreck things. With Afghanistan, with Keystone, with trying to stimulate the economy but causing out-of-control inflation, arguably stagflation now. Biden has done goddamn nothing. I sense another bumping down of his approval, by the way, as the result of this, because all of those people that aren't vaccinated, they're not all suspenders wearing toothless rubes wearing MAGA hats, Joe. A lot of those people are goddamn PhDs, and they're tired of your shit. About the only saving grace for Biden is that the court may make an aside and say, well, for federal employees it's okay because they're on the federal dole, they're more under the auspices of the federal government. But even then they might find that legislation is needed, and you're not going to get it under the current incarnation of the U.S. Senate. If they subjugate it to legislation and just say, well, you can't do this via executive order, you have to have the Senate and the House involved, which is fairly likely if they even make that aside, then Joe Biden fails again. Even the federal workforce won't have to be vaccinated. I know people in the White House don't apparently need to be. I think they have over 100 employees, don't they? I noticed that all the big pharma companies, none of them seem to mandate their workers be vaccinated. Some of them probably being in states that have banned it anyway. It'd be really funny if you end up with a situation where like Moderna, because of one of its field offices, ends up arguing against the vaccine mandate. You could end up with a really, really weird, screwy situation here, but I don't think that it'll go Joe Biden's way. People should protest. People should picket. People should demand that their employers protect them. They should write to their state houses, demand that the states protect them, and sue the federal government. But you don't need to be massively fearful about this, because when it almost inevitably makes its way before, at the very least, the federal court system, if not SCOTUS outright, I don't think that Joe Biden will legally prevail. Again, the 1905 case that some of the leftoids right now are talking about is essentially a 10th Amendment decision involving state power under legislative proposals, nothing to do with the president, the federal government, executive orders, and the overreach of a bureau that at the time didn't even exist. That's about all. Peace out.